Greetings, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. My name is David Sandalow. I'm the Inaugural Fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy at CEPA. And welcome to this event hosted both by the CEPA Center on Global Energy Policy and the Tamer Center for Social Enterprise at the Columbia Business School. We're delighted to welcome all of you and welcome our remarkably distinguished panel for this event, opening Climate Week, here on the first day of Climate Week. I was thinking recently of well, let me just start. I think most people in this audience probably know the basic statistics on climate change, so we won't spend a lot of time on that tonight, but 2016 was the warmest year on record, 2015 was the warmest year before that, 15 of the 16 warmest years ever recorded have been in this century. And current events have got me thinking recently of a speech that I worked on 20 years ago. I had the privilege 20 years ago to work on to help President Bill Clinton write a speech on hurricanes. In 1998, Hurricane Mitch devastated much of Central America. And I was working for President Clinton on the White House staff, and I worked on the speech, and he asked for a couple of paragraphs on climate change. And so it was my job to gather the best scientific learning from around the government, and we crafted a couple of paragraphs that made the point with very careful prose that the current scientific evidence did not suggest that hurricanes would become more frequent as heat-trapping gases grew in the atmosphere, but it did suggest that hurricanes would become more intense, that the warm water in the oceans and other things would lead to more intense hurricanes. And so we gave this speech to President Clinton. He read it as he got to the car. He gets up, he delivers this speech, and when he gets done reading those paragraphs, he said, "If you liked Hurricane Mitch, you'll love the 21st century." And it always stood out for me as an example of how remarkably glib President Clinton was, his remarkable facility with words. Those words weren't written for him. He just read those paragraphs and he put it on a bumper sticker. And sadly, it's turning out to be true. And we're seeing devastating hurricanes, not just in this hemisphere, but actually around the world. And this is what the future looks like unless we get a hold of the global warming problem. There is no solution to that to the climate change problem without the topic we're talking about today, which is climate finance. And let me just say a quick word about climate finance, which is our topic today. I went to look for definitions of the term climate finance in preparation for tonight. And interestingly, I came up with 4 categories of definitions, which is interesting. I'm just going to quickly run through them. The longest definition I found said, climate finance refers to financing from developed countries channeled by governments and intergovernmental entities to help developing countries cut emissions or adapt to climate change. So that's 4 pieces to it. And then I found some definitions that said, oh, no, climate finance refers to financing from developed countries to help developing countries cut emissions and respond to climate change, leaving off the part about governments. And then I found other definitions that says climate finance refers to financing to help developing countries cut emissions from climate change, leaving out the idea that the financing needs to come from developed countries. And then I found some definitions that say climate finance refers to financing to help cut emissions or adapt to climate change. Just any money to help climate change is climate finance. So I don't think there's any correct answer to this. I don't think there's any correct definition. But before I introduce our keynote speaker, I just want to make 2 observations about this. Whatever the definition is, I think climate finance is essential to meeting the climate challenge. There is no solution to climate change without resources. And whatever definition we choose, there's not enough of it. There's not enough money right now to address the climate challenge, which is why we need the leadership of really remarkable and impressive people, and why we're so fortunate tonight to have such a distinguished set of panelists, led off by Ambassador Howard Bamsey. And Ambassador Bamsey is the executive director of the Green Climate Fund, a position he assumed in January of this year. The Green Climate Fund is the fund organized under the United Framework Convention on Climate Change to help respond to climate change. Ambassador Bamsey has spent most of his career in international diplomacy and public service. He's a veteran and widely admired climate change negotiator who's co-chaired key processes under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. He's represented his government in many places, including in this city, so welcome back to New York, Ambassador Bamsey. And we are thrilled to welcome Ambassador Bamsey to Columbia University. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David, and good evening, everyone. This is, as David said, it's Climate Week. It's the time when there's such a gathering in New York of everybody who's involved in the picture, and people come and go all the time very quickly. So I'm just going to skim through some of the key points as I see them on climate finance this evening, and then hopefully add to that in the panel discussion. You won't see the Green Climate Fund logo on my slides. That's so that I can speak a bit more freely outside the bounds of our policy, which is set by our board, which is the UN climate process in miniature. So I'm speaking in my personal capacity rather than as the representative of the GCF this evening. Let's start with the Paris Agreement. It is the key motivator today of climate action, and certainly the key dynamic in climate finance at the moment, because the Paris Agreement is the policy centre of the whole climate change, international climate change process now. It is about policy, the agreement, but it's surrounded by a myriad of actions and actors, which we call now the Climate Action Framework, and it's those actors and those actions that are making the difference. The policy still matters, though. Yesterday, Morgan Stanley produced an analysis of what the impact might be of the US withdrawal from or intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And they said it doesn't matter so much because these days business and investment is driven by economics and technology rather than policy. But as a policy person, I think of economics and technology as really children of policy. So to me, the policy settings are still really fundamental. And Paris, I think, was important because it was the first time that in the climate change process, and David and I were talking a minute ago about our long time involvement in that process, and we saw meeting after meeting where national interests, countries' national interests, and the policies and positions they took were not aligned. So countries had an interest in an effective global response, but the positions they were taking for many countries were not aligned with that interest. And Paris finally did align national interest and the policy settings. So that was its huge contribution. The specific breakthroughs there, of course, were that for the first time, universal action was the theme, that is, all countries would contribute. We'd known forever that that was arithmetically essential if we were going to solve the climate problem, but this was the first time that it was agreed. And it was possible because of the arrangement on climate finance, which settled the equity question that for many years had bedeviled the negotiations. I'll come back to that in a minute. And the other important development or contribution of the Paris Agreement was that it integrated for the first time in a truly holistic way the climate change response, the global climate change response, and the development process. And as my heading here says, notwithstanding all the ups and downs and vicissitudes of politics, the Paris Agreement remains alive and well, and in most of the world is the is the node of climate activity. Just to go back a little bit, I mentioned that a deal on equity was essential to get Paris and to move the international negotiating process forward. Equity was all about the issue that developed countries had caused the climate problem and therefore should solve it, and developing countries should not have to bear the burden of solving the problem. This framing fitted into the dependency economics background to the debate about economics in the United Nations. And this guy here is Raoul Prebisch, who was one of the founders of dependency economics in the 60s and was in fact the founder of the UN Conference on Trade and Development, where the idea that the resolution of equity was wealth transfer from the developed world to the developing world was the centre of the approach to equity in international economic relations, and it was that notion which gave birth to this concept of common but differentiated responsibilities, which became the sort of ideological barrier to collaboration within the Climate Change Convention. That's probably more than we need to say about that issue, but I want to mention it because it underlines the break with the past that Paris represented, and therefore the possibilities of the future. And our organisation, the Green Climate Fund, was part of that break. It was an agreement settled finally at the 2010 meeting of the Climate Change Convention, but it was one that was fundamentally agreed the year before. And the agreement was that developed countries would mobilise, that's a very curious verb, $100 billion a year by 2020 to help developing countries respond to climate change. So going back to your definitions, David, that's, I suppose, why most of the definitions you found for climate finance refer to transfer from the developed world to the developing world. Arguably, though, climate finance applies everywhere, or the definition applies everywhere. 2015, the year of the Paris Agreement, was a remarkable year for multilateral diplomacy, because also in that year, the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed. They replaced the Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals were focused on development with not much reference to sustainability, and the SDGs were all about integrating sustainable into development. And here, universality was a step forward too, because the Millennium Development Goals had applied to development in the developing world. The SDGs apply around the world, everywhere. We also had the Financing for Development conference and its outcome in Addis, which arguably strengthened the notion that development occurs in many different ways and is supported from many different sources, something which we'd always known was the reality, but not everybody had acknowledged. And finally, we had Paris. All of these underpinned, I think, the critical role of policy in making things happen. This very confused-looking diagram is a sort of map of climate finance from a couple of years ago, prepared by the Climate Policy Institute. I wouldn't try to read it too closely. It's really just, I suppose, showing that finance comes from different sources and goes to different destinations in all sorts of fashion. It's a complicated landscape, climate finance. And one thing to bear in mind, I think, is that if you're a developing country with very limited capacity to understand what it is you need to do in order to realise your climate change aspirations, then this sort of map is not much help in a way, because it's bewildering if you don't know the landscape, if you don't know who to go to, if you don't know what sort of support you can get from where. This is actually an everyday problem now, because developing countries are in the game, are really trying to change their development pathway to integrate their development aspirations with their climate change aspirations, and it's not an easy task. So in that task, enter the GCF, the Green Climate Fund. It's part of that we are part of that $100 billion a year pledge. We have at the moment, depending on how you measure it, around $10 billion. And the various aspects of our mandate, I think, make us unique in the climate change finance, in that strange, bewildering map. We have a unique role. We are country-driven. That's something that every international organisation says, but we really try to live it. I can come back to that later if you'd like more details. We insist that our projects and activities are truly transformational. That's a very difficult concept to define in practical terms, but what we look for is systemic change caused by our projects, something that is essentially irreversible in whatever way the project operates. We emphasise what everybody knows, and that is that public funds are not going to be enough to change the climate pathway and bring us to a below 2 degrees solution. Our task is to use the $10 billion of public funds we have to catalyse change in investment patterns in the private sector. We often hear rather gloomy prognostications about the climate finance task. People say, well, you know, we've only got a few billions and the investment need is trillions. But I think that's a bit misleading, because those trillions are waiting to be invested. The role of the billions is to prepare the path, is to make it possible for those trillions to turn away from business as usual and be invested profitably in the climate response. So we're part of that. This is the GCF in a few numbers. So far, $2.2 billion worth of projects have been approved. You can see the sorts of benefits we're expecting and the numbers of people who will be touched by those projects. So although we still in the GCF have some startup characteristics, we are now moving to a more mature state, I think, and will be able to make a more secure contribution to the climate finance challenge. This is an illustration of something we've just done recently. We had a request for proposals out, excuse me, concluded about 2 weeks ago. What we were looking for were proposals from the private sector to mobilise funds at scale for climate action in the developing world. We focus solely on developing countries. I expected, maybe if we're really lucky, we'd get 50 proposals from entities, from organisations. In fact, we got 350. We're completely overwhelmed by this. It's an extraordinary response just from our to us, to the GCF, a relatively small part of the picture. If we were able to finance, to support all of the concepts that that have been brought to us, we would mobilise almost $50 billion, and I'm sure that would then catalyse even more responses and even more activity. So our initial steps are starting to really bear fruit that's more and more substantial. We're part of, we hope, the very dynamic landscape of climate finance, and here are just a few illustrations of activities that are part of Climate Week, of organisations that will be bringing together people for different purposes this week. The Climate Bonds Initiative had its event this afternoon and announced that it was about the state of the green bonds market, and they have calculated that what they call the universe of green bonds is now almost $900 billion. That's getting to be a sizable market, but the important thing is that it's increased by over $200 billion just in the last 12 months. And this is an idea that was barely thought of 5 or 6 years ago. So the trajectory, the dynamic, is very strong. Same is the case for green banking. There are a few green banks a few years ago, mostly very domestically focused, and today they had a meeting, a congress, where their network theme was making green banking truly global. So from a situation in which most climate finance, using the broadest definition, is found in the developed world, and most green banks are in developed countries, this network is now looking to globalise the green banking process and mechanism. On Wednesday, the lab, I think one of the very best things in climate finance, is meeting to review the many proposals that they have. And Jay Coe, who's helped put together tonight's session, has been successful in this context with the craft proposal, but the lab is focused on leading-edge innovation, absolutely new ways of fixing problems, and so far the results, though still really in the development phase, have been outstanding. Just to bring attention to a more US-centred set of concerns, perhaps, the insurance market is one of the nascent climate finance sources. There already is a lot of attention being given by insurance companies and reinsurance companies, and they were amongst the earliest to focus on climate change risk. And they're now, that focus on risk, which in its early stages led to differences in premiums and just refusal in some cases to insure people, in other words, some conventional commercial responses to risk. They're now moving to much more sophisticated responses and risk sharing, which can help deal with the threats to countries and regions from the increasing numbers, as David mentioned, of extreme climate events. I won't go into the details again, but this is an extremely interesting leading edge part of the climate finance landscape. And finally, because the organisers did ask me to talk a little bit about where the US stands now, but I suspect we'll spend a bit of time in the panel on that, so I won't say too much. One of the reasons I'm not putting my slides on your website is that this picture, the picture on the top, is a fictitious picture borrowed from Google of my rooftop in Canberra, in Australia. And it's real enough, though, because I installed PV in about 2 years ago. Australia, I think, still has the highest penetration of household solar in the world. So I was part of the trend at that time, and I had to decide where to get which panels and which inverters to select for my rooftop. And I chose American-made inverters because that's the intelligent part of the system, because there was a small increment in price, but a substantial increment in reliability and efficiency. And I suspect that was the case around the world. And what made that possible, what made my decision rational, was the effort being put into R&D in America, the leadership which American policy was providing in the response to climate change, in identifying the opportunities. American leadership was absolutely crucial for the Paris Agreement, and American leadership is still vital for the real opportunities of the climate response to be delivered. The big question is, does the President's decision mean that American leadership will disappear? I think the approach or the answer to that Morgan Stanley's analysis yesterday gave is very widely shared. And certainly we heard lots of it today at an event that the Secretary-General organised for climate change stakeholders in the UN. I can't remember now, to be honest, whether it was Al Gore or Jerry Brown who said that America is a place not of one top-down approach to anything, but a country of diverse centres of power, where there's a whole lot of stuff happening, whatever the administration says or does. And their view, the view of all of the Americans who spoke today, including some Americans from international organisations, was that there is so much happening still in this country, there is so much leadership available, that America will continue to be at the leading edge of climate action and one of the leaders of the global response. If that's the case, then the story of climate finance will remain a very strong one. All of those innovations in climate finance will continue to benefit from American contributions. And when the time comes to extend my PV back home in Canberra, I will again choose American technology. So let's hope that for your sake and my sake, that leadership continues. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Howard. That was tremendous, very thoughtful, and especially thank you for buying American inverters. We really appreciate that. Although this is a very international audience, I'm sure. We've got three tremendous panelists here. Let me introduce them, and then let me start with some questions building off of what you just said, and we'll just have a conversation. Immediately to Howard's left is Melanie Nakagawa, who is the head of climate initiatives at Princeville Global, an investment firm that backs rapidly growing technology-related companies around the world. She previously served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Transformation in the Bureau of Energy Resources of the U.S. State Department. She was on the State Department's policy planning staff and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff before that. And her most important qualification, she's a non-resident fellow at the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy. Immediately to Melanie's left is Mike Eckhart, who's Managing Director and Global Head of Environmental Finance at Citigroup. He previously founded the American Council on Renewable Energy, ACOR, which is a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit. He has a long history of leadership in the renewable and energy and power industries. He's received numerous awards, including the Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship. He served on submarines in the U.S. Navy. And like the person to his left, got his MBA from Harvard. Both of them they both overcome the handicap of a Harvard education and gone on to very successful things, which is I congratulate them for. Mike is Mike is an adjunct professor at CEPA here in Columbia. And
I see several of my students in the audience.
Well, these are brownie points, I'm sure. Okay, and then I'm particularly delighted to introduce Bruce Usher, who's hosting us here. So thank you, Bruce. Bruce and his center, the Tamer Center on Social Enterprise, are providing the room and the refreshments out there, which I commend you. So thank you very much. Bruce is a professor of practice and the Elizabeth B. Strickler and Mark Galogli Faculty Director of the Tamer Center on Social Enterprise here at the Business School. He teaches MBA students on the intersection of finance, social, and environmental issues. He's won a number of Dean's Awards for teaching excellence. Prior to his work here at Columbia, he was CEO of Eco Securities Group, which he built and then into the world's largest carbon credit company and then sold. He's founded other companies and, as I already said, has his MBA from Harvard Business School. Let me start. Actually, I want to start with the two business guys on the far left, on my far left, physically, if not politically. But before I do that, let me just say to everybody listening on live stream that you can ask questions. Please, you can send questions by Twitter to hashtag CGEP events. That's Center on Global Energy Policy Events. Hashtag CGEP events. We'll receive them, and then after we have a conversation on stage, we're going to bring the audience into this as well. But starting with Bruce, you heard Howard say that he's got billions, this problem needs trillions. The trillions are in the private sector. Any thoughts about, from your experience, how does an organization like this help to catalyze the trillions that are needed in the private sector?
I think from the perspective of the private sector, the opportunity, and I think, Howard, you referred to this, the opportunity today is extremely compelling because technologies that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, particularly renewables, and now electric vehicles, are becoming extremely competitive and in some ways the most interesting product to invest in today. And that's a very fundamental change from when I was working in the markets in climate. But there are funding gaps, and those gaps still exist, particularly in developing countries. And that's where the GCF can make a tremendous difference. In many cases, just bridging those gaps, sometimes referred to as the valley of death in funding, can really open up the gates to capital. I would say at this point, wind and solar, it's pretty much a done deal, is the way I see it. Wind and solar are the cheapest sources of power in the world today in many, many locations, and it's really just a matter of time before they're the dominant source of power. I think what's happening in the grid in many countries, the role of electric vehicles is still very much up in the air, and that transition's a much more challenging one. So that's, there may be a bigger role there.
Just before turning to Mike, just Howard, based upon what Bruce has just said, is the GCF funding solar projects, or is the GCS view that solar is cheap enough now that it doesn't need finance from the GCF? And similarly with electric vehicles, are you funding any electric vehicle projects?
We're not funding any electric vehicle projects, and we're prepared to fund solar projects where those projects represent a transformation. But in much of the world, as Bruce has said, it's lay down misère. I mean, I was reading in this Morgan Stanley report that I referred to earlier that recently an Arizona utility signed a 20-year power purchase agreement for solar power at less than 3 cents a kilowatt hour, which is just, if you follow this stuff, is just extraordinarily cheap. And so we wouldn't be in that game in Arizona or, you know, a relevant developing or similar developing country, because that's really mainstream. So we're looking for still the frontier projects, and there's still plenty of those in the developing world.
Mike, you played a very central role in launching the green bond market and have thought a lot about mobilizing large amounts of capital. Same question for you. Any thoughts about how the global climate, the GCF, can make a difference in mobilizing large amounts of capital?
Yeah, I'm hopeful that some new ideas. So once the GCF gets up and going, and you're doing such a wonderful job in the last year or so, everybody's talking about you. But there are elements that are not yet being addressed. And you've got $10 billion to work with, and I think, well, how can that best be used? And where do we want to go with things? You know, the public sector, and I appreciate everybody that I know who has worked in the public sector and the constraints, because, you know, if you add up all the debt of all the governments in the world, it's $73 trillion. If you add up all the GDP in the world, it's a remarkable number, $73 trillion. It's the same number in 2016. It's astonishing that the world has borrowed exactly 100% of our next year's economic activity. And that's why the public sector is constrained. It has no more borrowing capacity. And yet the total capital markets are $212 trillion. I want you to remember that number. There's $212 trillion of actual financial capital. Bain says that there's $600 trillion of total capital, including the value of this building, that the society has invested and put in place. But $212 trillion of that is actual money, securities. $147 trillion is the debt capital market, bonds, and $65 trillion is the equity capital markets, stocks. Okay, that money's out there. It's been invested, and it keeps turning over and over and over and over. And 10 billion is an interesting number, because at Citi, we do just our debt capital market operation, which is not a small part of our business, but we underwrite and place $10 billion of debt placements a day, just to get the scale of things between the public and the private sectors. So if you're caught in the mentality of the public sector, you're working with no availability of new money. You're fighting for every penny. And annually you get a budget. And you have to put that money out and so forth. The private sector's over here, and people at Citi are doing $10 billion a day, $1 billion an hour, just flowing. And all that $212 trillion is being reinvested every second of the day somewhere. And to me, addressing the climate issue is simply getting climate solutions constructed in a way that the people investing the money will find that interesting. It meets their criteria. And this can be done. That's what bankers do. You know, that's a great climate policy initiative map of flow. And I always chuckle when I see that, because I know Barbara, and she developed that. And believe it or not, that is what bankers do. It's like, that's the ocean, and we're the fishing guides. Okay? We know where the fish are, and we know how to get them. And that's what we do all day long, is help clients get that money. And what the public sector, because of procurement laws and municipal financing and treasury bonds and how all that works, seems to have no ability to simply knock on our door and say, can we retain you to raise money for us? It's a really simple process. And we don't get paid up front. We get paid a fee if it closes, that kind of thing. And so I really don't see the problem. I'm just saying, coming from the private sector, I'm teeing up that the problem is solvable if we can get private and public sector people in the same room. Just get us in the same room, like you're doing right now.
Melanie, thoughts on that?
I just want to underscore that point, actually, in particular. And it's a part that Howard touched on briefly, but I think it really deserves a bit more of a highlighting, which is the role the private sector facility plays, the recent RFP. But this notion, to Mike's point, I mean, to the GCF's credit, they've had, 146 applications for an accredited entity process. They've been able to move 54 into the accreditation process. But for those who don't understand the way it works is the unique nature of the GCF versus other types of international financial institutions is that they are giving some of that power into private sector entities to go forward and try to move some of this capital in really innovative and catalytic ways. Obviously, we need to see more accredited entities coming to the process, but they already have 54. They have a long backlog, granted, but the idea that they have these abilities to take advantage of the smart brains that are sitting in Citi and elsewhere to actually move faster and much more catalytic finance at a higher rate is really a key point of the GCF that makes it quite unique and really attractive to other players like myself in the private sector and others find that unique aspect really enticing to what the GCF is trying to create.
Howard, do you want to explain for people who may not be familiar with it what the private sector facility is and how it works?
Yeah. Essentially, it's just part of the Secretariat, unlike other international organisations where their private sector activities are separated with different governance structures from what they do in the public sector. We're not like that because we see our task, as Micah said, essentially of getting these trillions flowing, and so we can't be the source of the funds that will deliver the climate response. We can prompt them. And that's what we're trying to do. So just to give an illustration of the sort of what that can be, and of the point that Melanie was making, we have a project, for example, with Deutsche Bank in East Africa, working to bring electricity to people and places that wouldn't otherwise have it, and to do it in a climate-friendly way, solar. And they're doing it by using funding from us and funding that they are generating from the private sector, using our funding to prompt it, and they're setting up and funding new private sector, new companies in East African countries to take on this task. So they're providing initial funding and credit where in areas, in geographies where that was not available previously. That's truly transformative, I think, and that's if we can do that everywhere, which we can't, but that's our aspiration. Then we'd really be delivering a global response.
Bruce, you built a company in the 1990s, in the 2000s, I think, working in this area. So you've kind of have a historical perspective on this. How has this whole field changed over the course of the past 10 years?
So 10 years ago, the whole field was entirely reliant on policy. And without policy, without ideally good policy, nothing got done. No capital flowed without government subsidies. No credits got traded without caps that were enforced and the like. The fundamental change today is an awful lot of capital is flowing, and I think Mike would agree with this, without policy support. In fact, the biggest worry right now for people in the renewables business in the U.S. is not that the subsidies are going away, because they're going away. Not a big deal. The biggest worry is actually is negative policies. The Geneva trade dispute, which actually will penalize solar as opposed to subsidize it. So we're in a whole different world today of mobilizing capital. It's in most cases it's really about the commercial opportunity as opposed to the policy-driven. That's not to say policy doesn't have a role, because there's no policy, but good policy can make an enormous difference in speeding up that. I mentioned solar and wind are a done deal. Electric vehicles, big question marks and so on. The real question, though, is this stuff happening? Not the question is not, is it happening? It's happening, it's done. Is it happening fast enough to stop climate change? That's the question. And that's where the good policy makes a difference. That's where the policy support can speed it up.
You're also seeing this unique moment, too, in time where you're seeing sort of three pieces of a triangle coming together, if you will. So it's this trifecta of both the policy piece, which in some places was already there. You have the enabling environment on policy. A lot of the good work that's been done laid that foundation. But that's coupled with really innovative technologies that are happening as well. But that new third layer that is kind of coming online because of the digital transformation that's happening throughout all of our sectors is this business model innovation. So you're taking a technology that exists, you're taking the policy, and you're coupling that with a new business model for actually getting that to scale, which is where we talk about the types of things that the GCF can invest in, the sectors. Is it just now it's kind of vanilla solar and wind, but now you're looking at that next layer, something a bit more additional, which is now more to, sort of software systems, smart grid systems, microgrids. You have a new layer that's digitally connected, and so you really see this kind of three layers to a policy tech, and then the business model piece, which is quite unique, which is a new area again where GCF could really be catalytic if they kind of find a way to tackle those types of companies and those types of challenges, and really recognize the new world that we're in the advent of basically global connectivity.
Mike, what role do you think green bonds can play in this whole puzzle?
Well, as David knows, I actually wrote the green bond principles myself on a flight to San Francisco one night in 3 hours. And I was frustrated that several of the folks that were dominating the emerging green investment space, none of my friends had ever been involved in placing a bond. So they didn't know how the bond market works. And we have this $147 trillion out there that's doing just fine without the word green. And so how do we and again, we have to fit our needs to the way the market works. And so I just out of frustration, I said, and I got together for dinner one night with Suzanne Buck, the bond specialist at Bank of America Merrill Lynch, and we decided we've got to write it ourselves because we know how the market works. So we decided to do that. So share the credit with Suzanne. But the idea was we didn't try to define what's green, which was what everybody was doing. Instead, we defined the requirements to call your bond green. And the 4 requirements are you have to publish your decision-making criteria, your decision-making process. You have to sequester the funds so that they're actually green over the life of the bond, don't go into a coal mine on the way to the wind farm. And lastly, most importantly, is you must report annually after the fact what specific projects the money went into. And the beauty of the thing was, before the green bond principles, green bond investors or pension funds that were looking for green investments had to read every bond issuance in the world to find something green. What we created was an efficient market where, boom, issuer puts his hand up, her hand up, and says, I'm issuing a green bond. Radar picks it up, right up, no wasted time. Now we evaluate it, and we never defined green. We leave that to the market to decide, just like on creditworthiness. There's no word definition of creditworthiness. So the ratings agencies invented a language of creditworthiness called bond ratings. What we need is not a definition of green, but a language of green by which investors can discourse about is that a green bond or not. But anyway, what we did was said we're just going to we're going to ask the bond market to do what it can do without a gatekeeping definition. And specifically, we had in mind as we were working it up, and finally 4 banks and then 13 banks, and so we got it started, but give credit to everybody for launching this darn thing, can this work at $1 trillion a year? That was our question all the time. If anything in this guideline would be a ceiling not to get to $1 trillion a year, and after that, who knows? There's $12 trillion a year in bond placements of all kinds per year. Most of that is government bonds, but I'd ask you, what percentage of all bond placements would have to be green if we're going to achieve our climate goals? 10%? 20? How about 90? Okay? So we need to be able to scale to everything is green in the end. And that's what my vision of we've seeded something with an intention that this really goes full.
Let me shift to a couple different topics, and then I want to open it up to the audience for questions. We have a lot of expertise in the audience. First, Howard, I was very impressed reading about the GCF's gender strategy. And could you just talk about what you're doing to empower women in the fight against climate change at the GCF?
Well, in a sense, we're not doing anything new, but what we are doing is being extremely rigorous about gender equality in the operation of the projects that we fund. And we're finding that as Melanie said earlier, we have a curious business model. We don't do the projects ourselves. We use accredited entities to do it. We're finding that is bidding up the gender strategies of the accredited entities. They are very willing to do that. So we've got projects where my jet lag's just preventing one from coming to my mind, but there are a number of projects in which There's one in Mongolia, for example, where a bank, the bank that is our partner there, the Hus Bank, provides funding to women business people at lower rates. Especially, there's a particular mechanism they use for reducing the interest rates, and that's proving to be very spectacularly successful in its operation. That it's opening up opportunities for women that were not available before that. And we've got a couple of similar projects that are already beginning to change the picture for women in developing countries. So you will see in all of our projects a full analysis of the impact on women, and that will point the project developers towards measures within the project to improve the situation of women. I think it's gone well beyond the sort of box ticking, which was part of the reality before, and we're now beginning to see really genuine on the ground impacts from it.
Can I make a little comment from this morning?
Please.
It was just an observation from being in the financing the Agenda 2030 at the UN. And the Secretary General was there and made comments, and then the Deputy Secretary General ran the meeting. And I sent an email to my wife and 2 daughters. There's a really remarkable observation sitting in that meeting, is the men who gave remarks were negative. They saw the challenge of climate. It was unaffordable. Nobody had the money to deal with this, and we needed more funding from the north to the south. And it was the old UN thing. And the women who spoke, every one of them was the same. They see the opportunity. Climate solutions are not uneconomic. People can make money with this. We're going to go get the private sector capital. Let's get on with it. Totally positive. I just want the women in the audience to know that I noticed that difference. And I was embarrassed for us guys because the guys they hadn't got it yet. So.
All right, I want to ask about American politics. We're here in the United States, so we're going to talk about it, and then throw it open for questions. Let me start with, actually I'm interested in all 3 of our American panelists talking about this, but start with Melanie, who's worked in both the legislative branch and the executive branch. Obviously, the Trump administration is taking a very different view of this than the Obama administration did, and Howard spoke to this. But what do you think is the impact of the United, or how do you think the United States is going to respond to this challenge in the years ahead with all that's going on here?
So from a macro, there's 2 ways to look at that. One is the macro perspective of just overall climate action. One is the more narrow question of the GCF and the U.S. leadership there. Yeah. In terms of just the macro question, it's been, those who are at Climate Week or the opening ceremony today, or looking at, in my former boss, John Kerry's got a conference up at Yale happening today and tomorrow. It's amazing to see just the breadth of stakeholders that are coming in to talk about U.S. leadership. Howard hit a point on, which is that, regardless of what's happening at the federal administration level, you're seeing a groundswell of action coming from a diverse array of voices, from cities to governors to states to the private sector, multinational corporations. And many of those are going to be helping to support the GCF, whether it's through accredited entity status or through contributions or other ways of contributing to the GCF component. But overall, again, to what Mike just said, I hate to add to your impressions, but I am quite optimistic, actually, about where see, I fit that. But the reason why also I spent 8 years working for John Kerry, who's one of the most optimistic people I know on climate change. And so inevitably that sort of rubs off like osmosis. But the reasons for optimism is that you're seeing just a groundswell of action everywhere. You can see from private sector to NGOs to cities and states trying to contribute both financially, but also in terms of real action. I'm also seeing from the U.S. leadership perspective, Congress, there's, glimmers of hope of bipartisanship on a variety of things that are happening, and you're seeing different voices coming out, also speaking out about this and trying to defend budgets. Most recently you saw a budget defense on Capitol Hill for climate finance. So these are elements where, the hope is that eventually the loud chorus of the majority will ultimately win. And that's really where I see sort of the positive focus going forward.
I think what Senator Jeff Merkley led an effort to restore funding for the UN Framework Convention as part of the State Department budget, and it passed the committee in the U.S. Senate. Mike and Bruce, any thoughts on this topic from where you sit?
Yeah, I'd like to point to something.
Be negative.
No, look, as David knows and Bruce knows, I've been involved in renewable energy since 1976. That would be 41 years. So I started when it was beyond zero. And this whole thing is just, this is called success. I hate to tell you, but we've won the war. It's going to take another 2 or 3 or 10 years to kind of mop it up and really dominate things. But there's no stopping this now. It has reached the tipping point. And I should have retired 4 years ago, but I'm having so much fun because we're winning the war and this is great and everything is winning. And we do $25 billion a year in financings, just the renewables people at Citi. And that's a big number. And so it's really happening. Now, the point I want to make is to get, very important, and particularly for GCF, is to realize how to get the private sector money. And there is an answer. So the fishing guide here, let me tell you how to catch the fish. It's all about mitigation of risk. The whole thing, 100% of the issue is mitigation of risk. It's not about returns. Because the returns, nobody's going to do a spreadsheet on a project that doesn't have good returns. Now, maybe it's 5%, 10%, 20%, and so that will allow more risk as the returns go up. But in the energy business, the returns are pretty modest. You're not going to get so the issue is how low can you get the risk? How do you mitigate the risk? And one of the things I'd like to point out, Peter Davidson sitting here, raise your hand, ran the US DOE loan guarantee program. And one of the things the US government has done over the decades, nothing new, is loan guarantee programs for specific markets. I once had a reason to want to know how many loan guarantee programs does the US federal government have? And I put a staffer on it, and 2 weeks later he comes back and he says, 2,200 loan guarantee programs? Are you kidding? Almost everything in America's got a guarantee on it one way or another. If you're a veteran, if you're this, if you're that, if you're a winner. So anyway, I point this is what the UN is missing, and the World Bank, my good friends, the World Bank, are blocking because they don't want to go into the loan guarantee business, not in the developing countries where there's too much corruption, too much financial weakness. You guarantee something there, the guarantee's going to pay for it. They know that. So the issue is how can we institutionally create loan guarantee or other guarantees like offtake guarantees and minimal guarantees, partial guarantees, to deal in the developing countries without getting swallowed by all their problems. And I lay this at your feet as a great opportunity to set the pace on this, because from a banker's point of view, it's all about risk mitigation. It's the whole question.
We might put our friend Peter Davidson on the spot in a few minutes. Peter, as Mike said, not only ran the DOE Loan Guarantee Program, but is now the CEO of Aligned Intermediary, which is a very important company in this effort. But before we do that, Bruce, any thoughts?
One slight different perspective. We talk about international agreements and climate change more broadly. We're always thinking internationally, and that's primarily what this conversation is about. But if you want to address climate change based in the U.S., essentially you want to build stuff here, solar projects, wind project, anything you want to build here. You don't think a lot about federal politics. You think about state politics and policies, because that's generally what's going to affect your economics and what you're doing in state. And you think about local politics, because building stuff in the U.S. is really about how do you get approval to actually build. The construction part's really easy. It's all the regulations and the thickets of dealing with NIMBYism and all the other challenges around it. It's state and local. So on the state side, New York State right now is a phenomenal place to build renewables. There's huge support, a lot going on. That's really what's affected. So we've got 50 political environments to deal with here in the U.S., and they're all changing.
See a question right there. And let's see, we've got, I think Mike would be good because we're recording this.
Thanks so much.
Identify yourself.
Sure. My name is Tamer Malik. I used to be an undergraduate student at Columbia, 2011. Now I'm a trying to be a circular economy entrepreneur. I was actually at the School of Management John Kerry event today, and I think I'm going to represent the typical male species by saying that he was actually pretty, down about the fact that most people do not realize, the vast majority of the people do not realize the scale of the problem, which is climate change, and that's a big problem. And so my question really here is, and I'll just briefly mention that I follow a lot of climate scientists on Twitter, and they were cribbing about the fact that when Irma and Harvey happened, the news coverage in this country with all mainstream channels, so not just some like right-wing channels, but all mainstream channels did not really link the extremity of both these events to climate change, which is the reality. And so the vast majority of the people don't realize the gravity of the problem. And so how does that impact new financial products being created to resolve these issues when there's not a demand because there's not a realization of the problem?
Great. Bruce and Mike, how does this affect, if there's a lack of awareness of climate change, does that affect the creation of financial products?
Say that again?
If the assertion is that there's not a lot of awareness of climate change in the country, how does that affect the creation of financial products in this area?
I think that's part of the breakthrough that we have. That doesn't exist anymore. I mean, certainly there's some people in the backwater but I mean, there's nobody in finance and investment today that is not keenly up the curve on climate. I mean, it's a major factor. You might have a few people left, but instead of 2% of the people knowing about climate, now it's 98%.
In the finance world,
I'll give you
you're
2% that don't know, but okay, 98% were there. And the degree of, I said we can't ask the financial community to innovate in our direction. We have to innovate in their direction. And for all you students and working on this, make that your life's mission. You're not going to change the way investments are made. Just imagine yourself investing for a pension fund. You've got a role to do. You're making green investments. You've got a program going. You're looking at things a certain way, and you got to do so many millions a day. And are you going to stop and say, "Oh, how can I help this little solar project in Africa?" No. You don't have time for that. You got to get things done. So you've got to learn how they do it, like we did with green bond principles. We adapted our need to the way the market works and would accept. And that's what I call product innovation, is adapting us, not adapting the capital markets. The capital markets are going to do what they want to do. So how can we match that? And loan guarantees is the one way it's done, or offtake guarantees or partial risk mitigations is reducing the risk so that we fit in their risk profile, and boom, they make the investment. And
Other questions?
so my answer is yes, it's happening. Yes.
Do we have anybody to pass around a microphone? I guess we don't. So we will self-organize on that, everybody. Why don't we go right here and,
Okay.
Yep, thank you. And then we'll come over to this part of the room.
Thanks, everybody. Hi, Delilah Rothenberg. I'm with Pegasus Capital Advisors. We're a private equity fund manager, and I also used to work on the environmental and social risk management team at Citi. So really always love to hear folks
Now
from
you're working
Citi.
with John Cavalier and David Crane.
Oh, yeah, small world.
Yeah.
And we are very interested in a partnership with the Green Climate Fund as well. But my question is, given some of the research that has been out there that it might be too late for that 2-degree mark, I'm wondering what your interest might be, any of the panelists, in carbon negative technologies and sequestering greenhouse gas emissions. Thanks.
Are we doing around or?
Yeah, anybody?
Should we just go one off?
That's a good idea, but I'm going to answer your question, and the other
you
panelists do,
do.
because I've been working on that a lot. I've just been working a lot on carbon dioxide utilization, which is capturing carbon dioxide and putting it into marketable products, and have a report coming out. That's in about a month. So look for that, please. It'll be on our website, and let's connect on it afterward. I think it's a very interesting opportunity. If we could find genuinely marketable uses for waste carbon dioxide, it could be transformational in our approach to climate change. It's a challenging problem from a scientific, technological standpoint and from a market standpoint, but it's worth a lot of effort, I think. And governments are starting to pay attention to it. There's actually a mission innovation workshop on this in Houston coming up in the next month or so.
Actually, I'll just.
Event on Thursday. evening, if anybody's interested.
I also just want to add into that too, is we're actually starting to see a lot of companies that we're starting to talk to that have really innovative ideas and technology solutions, whether it's in sort of the cement industry or in data centers, about what are ways you can actually capture that carbon, put it into a new product line, or actually use that waste in some form. And so part of that deep decarbonization that's going to be needed for 80%, there's a lot of interesting opportunities for this going forward.
I wish I more about
Let
this.
me characterize that just shortly. If we all agree that climate change is the greatest threat to mankind, then solving climate change with one big solution is the greatest business opportunity of all time, which is why I know you're on it, right? And so you're really leading to the question, will we eventually solve the problem through management of the atmosphere? And to me, it's inescapable.
Okay, why don't we take two? We've got a lot of questions. It's going to be hard to get everybody in. So why don't we take two at a time right here, and then some quick responses. We'll move across the room.
Thank you. James Henley, I work at Moody's Investor Service. Quick question for the panel on green bonds in particular. What would be the one or two things that might catalyze the issuance of more green bonds to work towards the goal that you were referring to? Maybe Mike or anyone.
Then if you could just pass the microphone to your right.
Sure. Johannes van der Tuin, Credit Suisse. I think what we've seen in a lot of markets where there have been a lot of renewables coming, particularly solar, is the levelized cost of energy comes way down. And that's to the strength of these energy sources. So they're very competitive, but it's also very punishing for lots of participants within the market. So I'm kind of curious how you see the structure of the market changing over time as there's higher penetration of renewables.
Green bonds and market structure renewables. Do you want to start on, or Bruce, you want to start on this?
So no, green bonds.
Okay.
Well, Moody's was the first of the rating agencies to come out with its own guideline to issue second opinion on issuance of a green bond. And it was your associate, Henry Schilling, that did that, or led that. I know you probably worked on it too. And S&P came strongly on your heels. But I'll go back and tell a really quick story, an actual true story, that the president of one of the rating agencies wanted to have breakfast with me, or his staff did, and so we had a breakfast, and he was not in favor of letting his team work on green bonds until the term green was better defined. And just in humor at the breakfast, I said to him in the group, I said, well, just for conversation, would you give me your definition of the word creditworthy? And everybody laughed. Of course, they exist because you can't define that word, and hence they invented that language of creditworthy. And that was a true conversation that actually happened. And I think Moody's is still working on that language, right? Okay, so I think what accelerates it is a resolution of the uncomfortableness that an issuer would have wading into the green bond space when you've got NGOs arguing about what is green, and nobody's come up with a solution to that comforts the market. If I can say this, the equity capital markets are driven by excitement, and the debt capital markets are the ones driven by fear, okay, to lose some principal. So lowest risk, understood risk, communicated risk. And so I really challenge you to come up with the next level of Moody's guideline, which is a language of green, so we can communicate and rank green rather than just say yes, no. And I think that's
Bruce or Melanie, any thoughts on renewable market structure?
I mean, one thing is that as costs come down, in my mind, the benefit of that is actually creates new business opportunities for better ways to balance the system, broader balancing zones. You also look at ways to look at a much more holistic approach, especially in the urban space. So you got these incredibly low costs coming forward, which is crowding, it's basically causing some consolidation in the market, which has been problematic for some of the newer developers. But at the same time, it's creating new market opportunities. Once the renewables are online, you can actually create larger balancing regions. You can figure out new solutions to actually enhance more access to that cheaper cost energy. And so I understand that some people argue that low cost could create some problems, but again, at the end of the day, that's what's going to help lead to the proliferation of more technology.
I mean, our entire electrical system, our grid system, as you well know, it's a very insightful question you asked, is based on an old model. It doesn't fit well with renewables and wind, with intermittent distributed power. And furthermore, our policy environment here in the U.S., which regulates those markets across all the states and different markets, is also based on an old model, centralized model. So there's enormous disruption going on at the moment, and it's going to get worse. I think there's going to be a lot of pain out there for a lot of players. A lot of money is going to get lost in that process, which creates also a lot of opportunities. Ultimately, it's probably a good thing. It's creative destruction, and as Schumpeter wrote, that's ultimately going to have healthy results. But along the way, that destruction is going to cause problems. It's going to cause political problems. It's going to cause people to push back on a lot of these issues. And it's such a long number of issues. I can't address one issue. You know, the net metering debate is just one of many pushbacks going to occur.
Could I add one thing to
There's
support
questions.
that?
Why don't we, let's take some questions here. We got one right there. We've got a question right there. Yep. Why don't you do it, and then we'll go back here.
Say, no one's
Yep.
ever lost all their money in a power plant. It's never happened.
Hi, my name is Catherine Griffin. I'm a student in the executive MBA program, and then I work full-time at Enernoc, which is an energy company. And I was just curious, you mentioned that the green bond market has exploded in the last 12 months. Has a lot of that been because of the state policies that have been put in place, particularly like California, where there's been a lot of storage and battery development? And then the second part of my question is, do you expect to see that growth if other states don't start to put in place those same types of policies?
Thank you. I'm going to do my best to get as many people in here as possible. So when we go back, we've got two questions there. We're going to take here. Here you are. We'll do three at a time. Right.
Thanks, David. Ken Kramer, Rushton Atlantic, and a B School alum. In the private sector, you know, you want a triple B project finance bond, you know pretty much what your hurdle rate needs to be. For the ambassador, you've got this, you know, unexpected barrage of applications for, I imagine, all kinds of not apples and apples comparable projects. So from, you know, the Green Climate Fund's point of view, what, you know, can you describe something that looks like a hurdle rate or a minimum threshold of some sort of worthwhile outcome that you expect your projects to generate? And can they be compared across categories?
And third question.
Hello, my name is Javier Leon. I am from CIPA, proudly energy concentration. When you talk about the market and all the players of the energy, of course, if it's a free market, they can play along. But what happens with the public companies, electrical public companies, that can't compete in an open market? Do you think that it's a threat for a market problem or collapse? Because, of course, they have different needs and commitments. They need to invest, even if it's not profitable, because they have a full contract. But if a lot of solar energy enters to the market, they can have like any disruption or problem?
We got a lot on the table. Howard, do you want to start with hurdle rate for the GCF and then take up the energy efficiency and market questions?
Just to be very quick, we're still working on those sorts of metrics and getting them together. We have an investment framework, but because we have such different projects doing different things, and one thing we haven't talked about explicitly tonight, but is half of our business, is adaptation, where you have a completely different set of factors at play, and where we're seeing still relatively little private sector interest, something we're trying to change. So we haven't yet, we're not yet able to offer the sort of hurdle rate metric that you're suggesting, but we are working on different tools that are not far off, which would give a framework that would be more accessible to the financial world than the set of investment categories that we now use.
Maybe just go down the row. Melanie, Mike, and Bruce, just any thoughts? Or?
Yeah, I'll answer this question on utilities because it's really, really key. This is the key to the whole thing, this government-owned utilities. When I say you're developing a project in a developing country and the host utility is government-owned, that's a problem, because how can the World Bank oversee that project if the World Bank's member country is borrowing the money? It's all too complicated. And how can a private sector then sell into that with that risk, the offtake risk, and now can the private sector project get a loan guarantee where that feeds into the corruption? So it just can't get to it. And so I've suggested and worked with Melanie in her State Department days and David about the idea of offtake guarantees. And we'll talk about this maybe later. And what I've been recommending and have written a paper on 4 years ago is to establish a global offtake, clean energy offtake guarantee agency so that every clean energy project in the world has the same credit rating. Okay? Just lift it above Zambia's credit rating, lift it above Egypt's credit rating, lift it above Malaysia's credit rating. The world can't wait for all the world to be developed and creditworthy before we put in a solar project with private sector capital. But this is what the private sector capital requires, is low risk. So take that risk off, that if you generate the energy, you will be paid. And if the country doesn't pay you, the guarantee pays you and then calls the country and says, hey, what's going on? Right? So a whole regime could be created to lift all of this up. And now suddenly, boom, everything is financeable everywhere in the world with this mechanism. And I've even encouraged the GCF would consider itself creating this entity. And with insurance, you multiply your money 100 to 1, not 2 to 1. And so it has tremendous leverage. But thanks for the question. Right on point. Oh, the other thing, in India, an example of weak, broken utility, government-owned utilities that had borrowed too much money from the state-owned banks, and therefore they had too much debt, and the banks were overexposed to the utilities, and it was all locked up. And how could you finance a solar system in that mess? And we city, 2 years ago this week, recommended to the power minister, Goyal, that he had to create a rupee bond market to refinance the utilities to get them out of the banks so the banks would have liquidity to lend money to the solar projects and stabilize the whole thing. And Goyal got very angry at us sitting there, the three of us talking, that he knew he had to do that, but it can't be done. He didn't know how to do it. And so we suggested that he get his prime minister on the phone calling all high net worth Indians around the world and all institutions in India that these were his war bonds. Please buy these bonds. And he did. And as of last week, they have refinanced $36 billion US equivalent, half of the debt of the Indian utilities. So the second answer is not only to guarantee the offtake, but to work aggressively to restabilize the government-owned utilities, even privatization, okay, by creating local capital markets, because you can't do that with international money. Sorry, long answer.
Question there.
I just wanted to pick up on actually an earlier comment. I'm with the Canadian Consulate here in New York. We are running an event on Thursday about exactly what you mentioned, David, which is carbon utilization, using carbon as a feedstock for an industrial process. And I'd particularly like to extend the invite to this audience. The event is called Financing Game Changers in Carbon Management. You can find it on Google or find me afterwards, and I'm happy to extend an invite. Thanks.
Thank you. Others got a few, and then I'm going to ask Peter to say a word about, he's doing such great work. We'd take the opportunity of him being here to say a word about what he's doing. So, got a question here, I think?
Yeah, I'll just use my voice.
Okay.
My name is Cullen Brown, and I work with the New York Power Authorities. And I'm very curious, particularly in a state agency that's a blend of public and private, and very invested in the private sector. What do you see the future of the flows of financing to R&D, which is clearly, environmentalists such as Bjorn Lomborg really hold this idea strongly that R&D is really the most worthwhile investment. Do you see any big changes with all these public and international funds in the way that R&D is conducted?
Melanie, you want to talk about mission innovation and more?
That's what my notebook is, mission innovation. It's a constant reminder. Actually, it's a really interesting comment you make because actually most recently, the Department of Energy, the current administration, provided some funding for R&D efforts and catalyzing innovation out of the labs with private capital. And so, to talk about a bipartisan area of agreement is particularly in the R&D space. Obviously, a few years ago, Undersecretary of Energy, Secretary Moniz, he actually led a really large-scale effort to move forward every country to double their investment in R&D and really thinking about the investments needed 20 years out. The technologies we're going to need for actually to what David talked about, deep decarbonization. The technologies that are readily available today, technologies that we're looking at in the current fund I work for, are technologies that are scalable today, that are ready for breakout growth to address many of our current challenges and to get us closer to mid-century targets. But there still is a wave of research and development needed in new technologies out there, whether this is the hydrogen, the fusions of the world, that need to come online to really get you that 80%. Because all studies show that current technologies today will not get you to 80%. So that's really where it's critical to see some concentrated R&D, and efforts like Mission Innovation that was started a few years ago are really critical in getting forward to that area. But that's going to require from the US and other governments a bipartisan and a political will to actually make that upfront cost and investment. But there's been some great examples, even on the natural gas side, right? Without the R&D in horizontal drilling, you wouldn't see the shale boom that we see here in the United States. Same thing, this goes on and on for all different types of technologies. And so thinking about what is that next large-scale transformative shift that shale has done to the U.S. energy market, what does that look like in 2030, 2040? Is that going to be solar rooftops? Is that something we haven't even thought of yet? Is it the idea that there isn't a grid anymore and that there's a, so that's kind of the question where I think R&D is really going to be important. And one can hope, and we're seeing positive signals already with the most recent announcement out of this administration on energy, that potentially we are still in the game of focus on R&D to get ready for that 2030 timeframe when we need those technologies coming online.
All right. You had a question, sir?
Yeah, hi. Charles Berkman, Moody's Investor Service, actually working on the ESG risk and green bonds team. So thanks for your comments, Mike, on the methodology. We'll
Congratulations.
get back to you, and I'll do my regards to Henry, saw him this morning. The question, just bring it back to reality. So we have this climate bond, labeled green bond, climate aligned bond is about $1.895 trillion. And it took about 10 years to get to green bond market 10 years ago. And we've got $100 trillion need by 2030 from some organization. So we've got 13 years to go. How are we going to get? It seems like an impossible task. So do we need to start thinking about other solutions to get that, to meet that $100 trillion need, if it's taking so long already to kind of use green bonds and other green products over 10 years?
Can we take it?
Please.
The biggest constraint is, again, the nature of the bond market and adapting us to the bond market. The bond market likes the issuance of bonds at $250 million and up. The reason is institutional investors buy bonds. They're big funds, trillion-dollar funds, and they make investments in increments of 5, 10, 15, 25 million, all right? And they can't own more than 5% of an issuance. So if their minimum is 25 million, and there's your 250, 20 times that, or there's 500 million. So the bond market is a big money market, and even a $10 million solar PV project has a hard time fitting into a bond issuance to get funded out of the bond market. And so this is the immaturity of the situation. Even Citi, we haven't issued a green bond, even though we have lots of pieces, but we sold off pieces of most of our holdings, and so we have lots of $10 million positions, and it's hard to aggregate $500 million out of that. So one, the language of green, and second, ability to aggregate at smaller scale in the bond market. So we can be doing issuances of 50 million to create that culture so that the investors are not still investing in increments of 25 million and 50 million. So a couple of adaptations, don't make them change, but come up with tools to allow them to do this. Right now, they don't have tools to make an investment in a $50 million bond.
Peter, do you want to say a word about what you're doing at Aligned Intermediary and any thoughts you have about the GCF and what it could be doing?
All right. Well, thank you all for joining me here tonight. First on two things. Loan guarantee, Mike, you're completely correct. Thank you. It financed the most risky projects on the energy side that no other commercial bank would fund by definition. The success rate of those loans, 97%. So in terms of losses coming out of loan guarantee programs, proven over a 15-year history. So I fully agree with you. What I'm doing, which is maybe related, is all about how do you mobilize capital at scale and how do you get that capital from the largest global investors, pension funds, insurance companies, and sovereign wealth funds, which despite the facts, which I agree with completely, solar and wind have won. But if you look at the percentage of the endowments that are invested in solar or wind or green or clean, tiny. And we can't solve the problem of getting $1 trillion a year until we deal with that. So Aligned Intermediary, we are a collective of really 10 of the largest investor pools in the world. New Zealand Super, Kuwaiti Sovereign Wealth Fund, the Church of England, bunch of institutions who have joined that want to make green investments all at full market rates, so nothing concessional. But what they're finding, what we're finding, is the actual tools, the ways to invest in the market are extremely difficult. There's the fund world. There are not that many green-only funds in the world, whether infra or green growth. If they are, they have a fee schedule that's very unattractive to the asset owners. So there are issues with funds. Most pension funds are not rich in human capital. So in terms of direct teams, they don't have direct teams within that can really go after the investments. So even for those global institutions that want to do the right thing, it's very hard for them physically to find investment products to get into. And so that's what we're really doing through a collective grouping of the asset owners. We work only for the asset owners. It's not the intermediaries. So it's a struggle. We're financed by foundations initially, but we're really very encouraged. The foundations are joining. We do both direct investing, and now we're actually starting our own managed fund on a very different fee scale.
Thank you. Well, we could keep going on for a long time here, so we have less than 5 minutes left. And at the Center on Global Energy Policy, we start on time and we end on time, particularly since it's 8 o'clock. People want to get out. So let me invite each of our panelists to give any concluding thoughts, 60 seconds or less. I'll be brutal in enforcing that. Thank you for everything. Bruce, let's go down this way and give the last word to Ambassador Bamsey.
One closing comment. There's a lot of optimism on the business side. In this building, we're fairly optimistic about the opportunities around climate change, around the opportunities to invest, put capital to work to address climate, everything that Mike and I have been talking about here. I'm also affiliated with the Earth Institute. Columbia University has many of the world's leading climate scientists who work in the science of climate change. And they are not optimistic. They are extraordinarily pessimistic. When I go to those meetings, I come out just shaken. My view on this is that we are in the race of our lives. The science is telling us that we are in a very, very bad position. And we need to do something about it very quickly. On the business side, we're racing ahead saying it's all great. We'll see who wins. But to me, that's the divide. It's not a men, women, it's science, business.
Mike, it's great.
Well, it kind of goes to the question about managing the atmosphere. My own conclusion as an engineer actually is that we will end up in managing the atmosphere as the solution to climate change because we will, as shall I say, fail to accomplish, and you do get depressed and you got to do something about it. So we're not going to get there. We're not going to get there on climate with wind and solar and clean energy. I'm sorry, it's in my assessment, not even close. So we have to move to bigger things, and I believe that we will. But what I'm positive about is that the war has been won, is the way I put it. It's not over, but it's been decided. And there's more to do, but we're developing tools. We're actually scaling the finance. We're actually cracking the capital markets. We're opening those doors. And I'm not optimistic that we're going to solve the climate change problem. I'm optimistic that our current path will continue and be successful and get bigger and scale, and then we have to do more.
And to the point about these bigger things that we need to move to, and I think it's also a good sequence as we move over to Ambassador Bamsey, one of the bigger things is, when you opened the session with this climate finance and the Green Climate Fund, and how the Green Climate Fund, which is this bigger thing that's out there that's mobilizing real scalable investment, and to pull on some themes we heard about today, to me, I see, and to the point you asked for Peter, the opportunity for the Green Climate Fund as a bigger thing is to serve as a risk mitigating mechanism to actually go where other multilateral development banks do not go and cannot go because of their current structures, and to be a new sort of product, if you will, that can finance those types of things that might be riskier or harder to get to, and things that are outside the traditional multilateral development bank space as a real opportunity to solve this challenge. And to address your question, what then does climate finance look like? I think it's going to be that slide that the ambassador had, which had those 4 different, whether it's FFD, state SDGs, the Green Climate Fund, and climate bonds and green bonds, could really be this sort of the universe of what climate finance looks like in the ideally 21st century.
Howard, we're very grateful that you spent time with us. Climate Week is a very, very busy time, we know, and coming up to Columbia is a big commitment, so thank you very much. Any final thoughts?
Thanks very much, David, and it's been a delight. And fortunately, Melanie summed up, I think, for me. So all I'll add is we do have that flexibility that she said is so desirable. We have embarked on guarantees, though only tentatively and very carefully. But we will do more. And I agree. I think it was Mike who said that really the secret to fixing this problem is getting people in one room who don't know that they need each other. because when they get in the room, they find out they do and that they can help one another. And I hope we can play a role in that. Thanks.
Please join me in giving them a big hand.